My name is Arthur, and I'm what you might call a man of simple principles. I believe in hard work, in loyalty, and in the quiet dignity of keeping your promises. For most of my life, those principles served me well. But then came the day when my own daughter looked me in the eye and said, "You will either serve my husband or get out of my house." In that moment, I didn't get angry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply smiled, a sad, tired little smile, picked up the suitcase I had already packed, and walked out the door of the home I had paid for with my own sweat and savings. She was expecting me to crumble, to beg, to do what I always did, give in. But this time was different. A week later, my phone showed 22 missed calls, and that, believe me, was only the beginning of my plan. They were about to learn that a quiet man's principles can be the most unbending force in the world. Before I tell you how this all unfolded, do me a small favor. Hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It means a lot to know who's out there listening. The keys were still warm in my palm when I pushed through the front door. I had a grocery bag in each hand, and the plastic handles were cutting deep into my wrists. You know that feeling? It was a Saturday afternoon, and the spring sunlight was filtering through the living room curtains, making everything look soft and peaceful. Usually that sight made me smile, but not today. There he was, Leo, my son-in-law, sprawled out in my leather recliner. That was Eleanor's last gift to me before the cancer took her. His feet, in their dirty socks, were propped up on the footrest, and a half-empty bottle of expensive beer was dangling from his fingers. The TV remote was resting on his belly like a king's scepter. He didn't even bother to look up from the basketball game. "Hey, old man," he grunted, "grab me another beer from the fridge while you're up." I just stood there for a second, feeling the weight of the milk cartons and the loaves of bread. I slowly set the grocery bags down on the floor. House. The big deal was that I was 68 years old and had just carried his groceries and his beer up the steps. His feet hit the floor with a heavy thud. He stood up slowly, deliberately using his height to loom over me. At 30, he was a big guy, much broader and taller than me, but I've dealt with bullies my whole life. You learn a thing or two. "Your house?" he scoffed. "That's funny, because last I checked, your daughter and I live here. We pay the bills." With my money, I thought, but I didn't say it. Details, right? He took a step closer, the beer still in his hand. "Look, Arthur," he said, his voice dropping into a low, threatening tone. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. You want to keep living here in peace? You play ball. It's as simple as that." Just then, the kitchen door swung open and my daughter, Amelia, appeared. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was wiping her hands on a dish towel. She took in the scene in an instant, Leo standing over me, the air thick with tension you could almost see. "What's going on?" Her voice had that sharp, warning edge I remembered from when she was a teenager. "Your father's being difficult," Leo said, without even taking his eyes off me. "I just asked him to get me a beer, and he's turning it into a federal case." Amelia looked at me, and what I saw in her eyes broke a piece of my heart. It was disappointment, like I was a toddler throwing a tantrum. "Dad, just get him the beer. It's not worth fighting over." But Leo wasn't finished. He moved even closer, so close I could smell the stale alcohol on his breath. "See, Arthur, let me explain how this is going to work from now on. You live in our house. You contribute, and that means when I ask you to do something, you do it. No questions, no attitude." Our house. The words just hung there in the quiet room. I kept my voice perfectly level, even though my heart felt like it was hammering against my ribs. "That's right," Amelia said. Stepping up to stand beside her husband, she presented a united front, a wall I couldn't seem to break through. "Dad, you need to make a choice right now. Either you help Leo and do what he asks, or you can pack your things and leave." There it was, the ultimatum. The words filled the space between us like smoke. I looked at my daughter, my Amelia, and I searched her face for any trace of the little girl who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms, the girl I read stories to every single night. But all I saw was a stranger staring back at me with the same entitled, cold expression as her husband. "All right, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Leo smirked, a smug, triumphant look spreading across his face. He thought he'd won. "Good," he said, starting to turn back to his recliner. "Now about that beer." "I'll pack." The smirk vanished from his face as if it had been wiped clean. Amelia's mouth fell open, just slightly. I could see the shock in her eyes. She expected me to crumble, to beg, to do what I always did, give in. But this time was different. I turned away from them, leaving the grocery bag sitting there on the floor, and walked toward the hallway. Behind me, I heard Leo's sharp intake of breath and Amelia's faint whisper, "Dad, wait." But I was already walking. My footsteps were steady on the hardwood floors. Eleanor and I had spent a whole summer refinishing together 20 years ago. Every step was a memory, and every memory was a reason why I couldn't stay. The suitcase came down from the top shelf of the closet with a soft, dusty thump. I'd bought it for our honeymoon, a trip to Yellowstone back when Eleanor was still alive, and the future felt like a wide-open road stretching out forever. Now it gaped open on the bed, empty, waiting to swallow up the last few remnants of my life in this house. I packed with a strange sense of calm, methodically. Underwear, socks, a few changes of clothes. I wasn't taking everything, just enough to get by. From the living room, I could hear their voices, a low murmur of urgent whispers. Leo's voice would rise every so often, sharp and angry, followed by Amelia's softer, more uncertain tones. They were trying to figure out what to do, how to handle the old man's quiet rebellion. My hands moved without any conscious thought, folding shirts, rolling ties. The framed photo of Eleanor that always sat on my nightstand, I wrapped it carefully in a t-shirt and tucked it into the side pocket. My medications, my reading glasses, the small leather-bound journal where I tracked every single penny of my expenses. When I wheeled the suitcase down the hallway, they fell silent. Leo was back in the recliner, but he wasn't relaxed anymore. He was sitting ramrod straight, watching me, his eyes narrowed. Amelia was standing by the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She was trying to look stern, but I could see the uncertainty, the flicker of fear in her eyes. Neither one of them said a word as I walked past. Not goodbye, not sorry, not anything. The car, my old reliable Buick, started on the first try, just like it always did. I backed out of the driveway slowly. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't want to see if they were watching from the window. The 30-minute drive to the Pine Lodge Motel gave me time to think, and the memories came in waves, each one a fresh sting. I drove through downtown Kalispell. The town ride built my life, and I remembered Amelia's college tuition. $40,000 a year for that fancy private school she just had to go to. I'd worked overtime at the bank for 4 straight years to make that happen. I took on extra clients, stayed late almost every night reviewing loan applications until my hands cramped. I can still feel that ache sometimes. Then there was the wedding. $25,000. Leo's family, it turned out, couldn't afford their half, so I'd quietly covered it. I didn't want to embarrass anyone. The reception hall, the flowers, her dress, everything had to be perfect for my little girl. That's what I told myself. That's what Eleanor would have wanted. And then the house. $80,000. That came directly from my retirement savings, a huge chunk of what I had planned to live on. It was for their down payment, because, young couples need a little help getting started. That's what fathers do, I reasoned. That's what Eleanor would have wanted. And after that, the monthly payments became a regular thing, as predictable as the sunrise. $1,200 for their mortgage, because the house was still in my name. $300 for the utilities. $500 for groceries whenever Amelia would call saying money was tight. My Social Security check, the money I had earned over a lifetime of work, just disappeared into their lives, piece by piece. And for years, I'd had convinced myself that this was love, that this was what it meant to be a father. The Pine Lodge Motel sat on the edge of town, a low, unassuming building with faded paint and a neon sign that flickered like a dying heartbeat. The room was small, but it was clean. It had a bed,
a chair, and a tiny table by the window. I set my suitcase on the luggage rack and sat down heavily on the edge of the mattress. The silence in the room was different from the silence at home. It wasn't a comfortable, lived-in quiet. It was a hollow, empty silence that echoed with the loneliness of a temporary space. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. I wasn't looking for friends or family. I was looking for numbers I knew by heart from my 30 years in finance. Bank numbers, insurance companies, credit card services. Tomorrow was Sunday. But in today's world, some things can always be done. Some calls can always be made. I opened my laptop on the small, wobbly table and logged into my online banking portal. The account balances glowed on the screen. Checking, savings, my retirement accounts. They were just numbers, but they represented a lifetime of careful planning, of saying no to myself, of denying myself small luxuries so that I could take care of my family. The cursor blinked expectantly in the search bar, waiting. It was time for me to decide what came next. Sunday morning dawned gray and overcast, a perfect match for my mood. I spread my paperwork out across the motel table, arranging it like a general planning a military campaign. Bank statements, insurance policies, legal documents, everything was organized. Everything was within reach. 30 years as a financial planner had taught me the value of being meticulous. My first call was to First National Bank. I knew their Sunday operations were limited, but the automated systems, well, they never sleep. After navigating the maze of the phone tree, a polite voice finally answered. "Good morning, Mr. Miller. How can I help you today?" "I need to cancel an automatic mortgage payment," I said, my voice steady. "It's for the property at 847 Pine Street. The payment is from my account ending in 4729. There was a pause on the other end, the sound of computer keys clicking softly. "Sir, I show that this payment has been active for the past 5 years. Are you certain you wish to discontinue it?" "Completely certain," I replied. "May I ask the reason for this change, sir?" I took a quiet breath. "The homeowners," I said, choosing my words carefully, "no longer qualify for my financial assistance." More clicking. "Very well, Mr. Miller. The automatic payment will be canceled effective immediately. You should receive a written confirmation in the mail within 3 to 5 business days." The second call was even easier. Geico had been insuring both of their cars on my policy for 3 years, Leo's big Silverado and Amelia's little Honda. That was $280 every single month for vehicles I never drove, providing coverage for accidents I would never cause. "I need to remove 2 vehicles from my policy," I told the agent. "My daughter and son-in-law will need to establish their own coverage." "And when would you like this change to take effect, sir?" "Today," I said. The credit cards, now they took a bit longer. Amelia was an authorized user on 3 of my accounts, Visa, MasterCard, and the store card from Costco. For years, I'd been paying down balances of $500 or more a month, balances I had never created for purchases I had never made. "Mr. Miller," the Visa representative explained patiently, "removing an authorized user will require them to apply for their own lines of credit. Any outstanding balances will remain your responsibility, but they will no longer be able to make new charges on the account." "I understand completely," I said. "Please remove them immediately." With each call, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. It was a strange feeling. 30 years of banking experience had taught me the ins and outs of these systems, the precise legal language, the proper procedures. Everything I was doing was methodical, logical, and completely within my rights as the account holder. The last item on my list for the day was my life insurance policy. Changing the beneficiary required written documentation, but I started the process. It was a $100,000 policy that was supposed to go to Amelia, money I had set aside to protect her future. But my idea of family, and my idea of the future, had changed dramatically in the last 24 hours. By noon, I had made 8 phone calls. The mortgage payments were stopped. The car insurance was canceled. The credit cards were blocked. The automatic transfers that had been slowly bleeding my accounts dry for years, all of it was over. All it took were a few polite conversations and a list of confirmation numbers. I leaned back in the cheap motel chair and looked at my notes. Confirmation numbers, reference codes, effective dates. It was a paper trail of my newfound financial independence. My phone sat on the table, silent. No missed calls, no urgent texts. They didn't know yet. They probably wouldn't know until the first payment bounced, until the first bill arrived with their names on it instead of mine. But they would know soon enough. I closed my laptop and walked over to the window. Across the parking lot, an elderly couple was loading suitcases into a pickup truck. The husband was doing the heavy lifting, while his wife directed the operation with a kind of gentle efficiency. They were probably heading home after visiting grandchildren, or maybe they were finally starting a long-postponed vacation. I felt a pang of envy watching them, seeing the easy partnership they shared, the way they moved around each other with a practiced, comfortable familiarity. Eleanor and I were like that once. My phone buzzed across the table. An unknown number. I looked at it for a moment, then let it go to voicemail. Not yet. I wasn't ready to talk yet. I was still busy taking things apart. Rebuilding would have to come later, if it came at all. The week passed in a blur of quiet routine for me, but apparently not for them. I settled into a new rhythm at the Pine Lodge. I'd get coffee from the lobby in the morning, have breakfast at the little diner down the street, and take long walks through Kalispell's quiet neighborhoods, just watching the world go by. My phone, meanwhile, was accumulating missed calls like a stamp collector I had no interest in becoming. By Wednesday morning, there were 12 of them. By Friday morning, that number had climbed to 22. I decided to listen to them all in chronological order, like listening to a story unfold. It was fascinating in a sad sort of way to hear the progression from confusion to anger and finally to utter desperation. The first few messages were almost casual. It was Amelia asking if there was some kind of banking error with the mortgage payment. Then it was Leo leaving these brief, annoyed messages about the car insurance lapsing. But by the middle of the week, you could hear the panic creeping into their voices. "Dad, what the hell is going on?" Amelia's voice cracked with frustration in one message. Leo's messages grew more and more aggressive. "Arthur, you need to fix this right now. I've got people asking me questions about my insurance. You're making us look like deadbeats."
The later calls, the ones from Thursday and Friday, they bordered on begging. There was one where Tiffany was audibly crying, promising they'd work something out if I would just please call them back. Leo even tried a different tactic, his voice suddenly soft and conciliatory, claiming he'd been too harsh and that he wanted to make things right. I deleted each message right after I listened to it. I felt a strange detachment, a mild curiosity about their growing chaos, but nothing more. Then, on Thursday morning, there was a knock at my motel room door. It was loud and insistent. I peered through the peephole and saw them both standing there. Amelia was wearing a wrinkled sweater, and Leo was in his work clothes. They both looked like they hadn't slept in days. I opened the door, but I didn't invite them in. I just stood there, blocking the entrance. "Dad," Amelia started, her eyes red-rimmed. Her usual composure was completely gone. We need to talk." "About what?" I asked calmly. Leo pushed forward, his face flush with anger. "About the fact that you're trying to ruin our lives over some stupid argument about a beer?" "I'm not trying to ruin anything, Leo," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "I am simply no longer paying for your lives." "The mortgage, Arthur," his voice rose. "You can't just stop paying the mortgage. That's our house." "Actually," I corrected him gently, "it's my house. My name is on the deed. My signature is on the loan. You two were just guests." Amelia quickly grabbed Leo's arm as he took another step toward me. "Dad, please," she pleaded. "We can work this out. Leo was wrong to talk to you that way. We both were. But you can't just leave us like this with no warning, no discussion." "I gave you an ultimatum," I reminded her, my gaze unwavering. "Do what Leo says or get out." Those were your exact words, Amelia. I didn't mean it like that." "Yes, you did," I said, looking at my daughter and seeing a stranger wearing her face. You meant every single word. You just never, in a million years, expected me to choose option 2. Leo tried to regain control, his voice taking on an artificially calm tone. Look, we all said things we didn't mean, but we're talking about our home here, our credit, our entire lives. You can't just pull the rug out from under us like this. I can, I said simply, and I did. You wanted me to leave, so I left. You wanted to handle your own lives, so now you can. I started to close the door. Dad, wait, Amelia's voice broke. What about family? What about everything we've been through together? I paused, my hand on the doorknob, and looked at her desperate face. For a fleeting moment, I remembered the little girl who used to help me rake leaves in the autumn, the one who would bring me handfuls of dandelions she'd pick from the yard. But that little girl had grown up into a woman who could stand by silently while her husband humiliated her father in his own living room. Family works both ways, sweetheart. I spent 5 years taking care of you both. When it was time for you to show a little care for me, you chose him instead. Leo's fake composure finally cracked. You crazy old bastard! You can't just... I can call the police if you continue to raise your voice, I interrupted him cleanly. This is private property and you are disturbing the peace. They just stared at me. I think in that moment, they were seeing me clearly for the very first time in years. Not as the soft-hearted father, not as the convenient bank account with legs, but just as a man who had finally learned to say no. Leo grabbed Amelia's elbow roughly. Come on, he snarled. We'll figure this out ourselves. They walked back to their car, Leo's usual swagger completely gone, replaced by the worried hunch of a man in trouble. Amelia glanced back over her shoulder one last time, her expression a mixture of confusion and hurt, like she was looking at a complete stranger. I watched them drive away. Then I closed the door and returned to my laptop. There were still more calls to make, still more accounts to disentangle. The work of dismantling a one-sided relationship, I was learning, was far from finished. I knew I needed to think, to get out of that stuffy motel room. The diner on Main Street had always been a refuge for me, especially in the years after Eleanor passed. I'd go there for a quiet cup of coffee and just watch the world go by. So, on Tuesday morning, I found myself walking the familiar 3 blocks, my breath misting in the crisp mountain air. The routine felt grounding after the chaos of the last few days. The little bell over the diner door chimed as I entered, and the familiar smell of coffee and bacon grease wrapped around me like a warm blanket. I had just settled into my usual corner booth when I heard a voice call out my name. Arthur Miller! Well, I'll be damned! I looked up and saw Ben Harrison rising from a table near the window. Ben and I had worked together at First National for over 15 years before he was transferred to the main branch. He handled commercial loans, I handled personal accounts. But we'd shared enough coffee breaks and complaints about management to consider ourselves friends. Ben, I said, standing to shake his hand. It felt good to see a friendly face. Mind if I join you? He asked, already sliding into the seat opposite me. Haven't seen you since Eleanor's service. Heard you're staying out at the Pine Lodge. Everything all right? The waitress appeared with a pot of coffee before I had a chance to answer. I used the brief interruption to decide how much I should share. Ben was a good man, but he was also a banker with professional obligations. Family situation, I said, as finally as she filled my cup. Just needed some space to think things through. Ben nodded slowly, studying my face with the practiced eye of a man who listens to people's problems for a living. That son-in-law of yours, he said, lowering his voice slightly, tried to pull a fast one on us a couple of months ago. My coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. What kind of a fast one? Wanted a home equity loan, Ben said, his expression darkening. $50,000 on your house. The background noise of the diner seemed to fade away. My house. Leo wanted to borrow $50,000 against my house. That's right, Ben continued. He brought in some paperwork that looked official enough at first glance, but when we ran the title search, Ben shook his head. Everything came back to you, of course. Clean title, no cosign. Deliberate fraud. The documents he brought in, the ones that supposedly gave him ownership, they were forgeries. The words hit me like a splash of ice water. 3 months ago, while I was paying his bills, buying his groceries, and putting up with his disrespect, Leo had been actively planning to steal from me. This wasn't a recent development born out of our argument. This was a premeditated crime.
Did you report it? I asked. We rejected the application and flagged his information in our system. Since no money actually changed hands, it's a bit of a legal gray area. But I kept copies of everything, just in case. Ben looked at me, his eyes filled with concern. You really didn't know about this, did you? I just shook my head, my mind reeling. I thought about all those dinners where Leo had complained about money troubles, all while he was secretly plotting to rob me blind. What was he going to use the money for? Ben glanced around the diner before leaning in closer. According to his application, it was for home improvements, but the word around town is that Leo's got some serious gambling debts, pretty substantial ones. How substantial? You know Detective Miller? His daughter was in Amelia's graduating class. Jim mentioned something to me a while back about Leo being a regular fixture at the Glacier Peaks Casino. He might know more. I did know Jim Morrison. We'd served on the church building committee together. If anyone had accurate information, it would be him. Ben, I said, my voice thick with a gratitude I couldn't fully express, I appreciate you telling me this, more than you know. I pulled out my wallet to pay for the coffee I had barely touched. Arthur, be careful, Ben said, his hand on my arm. A man who would forge documents to steal from his family? There's no telling what desperate things he might do when he feels cornered. I walked back to the Pine Lodge with my mind racing. The pieces were all falling into place. Leo's constant disrespect, his demand for the beer, the ultimatum. It all made a terrible kind of sense now. He hadn't just seen me as a burden. He had seen me as a mark, a convenient source of cash to fund his secret gambling habit. The fight hadn't been about establishing dominance in the house. It had been about maintaining his access to the money he already believed he was entitled to steal. Back in my motel room, I opened my laptop and created a new document. I titled it, Leo Thompson, Evidence. Ben Harrison's revelation was just the beginning. If Leo had been lying about this, what else had he been hiding? I knew then that my quiet, systematic dismantling of his financial support was no longer enough. This had moved beyond a family dispute. This was something else entirely.